Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Mateo, and I serve as Deputy Director of Programs and Partnerships at Carnegie Council. To begin, I'd like to welcome you all to our fourth event in the Council's Ethics Empowered Leadership and Practice series, which convenes scholars and practitioners to discuss pressing moral issues, reflect on their careers, and offer insights to young leaders. In today's panel, we will be re-examining our capacity for just peace amid ongoing current regional wars, frozen conflicts, and the deployment of new military technologies. It is my pleasure to now introduce our moderator for this event, Peter Hoffman, Associate Professor of International Relations at the New School. We're also honored to welcome our panelists, Asha Castleberry-Hernandez, Adjunct Fellow at the American Security Project, alongside Scott Silverstone, Professor of International Relations, Navy veteran, and former Carnegie Council Fellow whose research focuses on the causes of war, military power, strategy, and great power competition. Before I pass the microphone to Peter, a reminder that towards the end of the program, we will have a brief Q&A with the panelists. For those in person, we have note cards on the seats for you to write your questions. We will collect your questions in advance prior to the start of the Q&A. For those joining us virtually, please submit your questions to our panelists directly via the chat feature. Following the event, our team will publish the full event as a video, podcast, and transcript, alongside additional educational resources and discussion questions that can be leveraged in the classroom. As we convene in Carnegie Council's Global Ethics Hub in New York City, I want to welcome you again and will now pass the program over to Peter.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everyone. Forgive me, I'm going to use my notes cards as well. The older I get, the more loquacious I get. I'm afraid I used to speak in sentences. Now I speak, I think, in paragraphs and chapters. So I'm going to try and stay focused by using my cards here. Violence and justice are central elements of social life. Kinetic, coercive acts, writ large, are a common occurrence throughout history, but so too is humanity's capacity to refrain from and restrain armed conflicts. Technological and strategic innovations in war and warfare reverberate throughout societies, reflecting not only the price of deploying force, but also stoking political debates over what is just and humane in war, and this, in turn, often shapes prospects for peace. Consider the scope of the problem. Since 1800, over 37 million have died on battlefields, increasingly a larger proportion of them civilians. For 2024, estimates range from 130,000 to 230,000 killed in armed conflicts. Even at the low end of these estimates, they are far above the average of the past 30 years. The present trajectory for 2025 is approaching 200,000 fatalities, which is around double of what it was just 5 years ago. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Israel's genocide in Gaza get the most attention, but violence in Sudan and other parts of Africa and the Middle East also contribute to these horrible global trends. Moreover, aside from these shocking casualty counts, the problem of war also manifests in the consumption of resources. Global military expenditures in 2024 reached $2.7 trillion, up 9% over 2023. Furthermore, the carbon footprint of armed conflict is also substantial. It is estimated that global military activities account for approaching 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. We need not get lost in all the data points about the frequency, intensity, and costs of war to know that it is imperative to ask, how do we get to peace? This is where the issue of justice looms largest, as we need to understand the connective tissue between war and peace, which is the underlying premise of today's conversation. So let me start by asking our panelists about the nature of justice and how and where it fits into the equation of war and peace. I want to start by having each of you speak to just war issues with regards to the recourse to a use of force and conduct in using force. We'll begin with the ad bellum tradition. So the first question is, what are the justifiable reasons for using force? How can the decision to use force be legitimate? I'll start on my immediate left. Asha?
Okay, yes. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to to discuss this such relevant question or just theme overall. And I just want to put my disclaimer out there. My views do not represent the United States government. As far as looking at the features or the justification of the use of force, one point you could start at is pretty much common sense, where when you look at the threat, is the threat considered a clear and present danger to a specific sovereign state or a local population? Is the threat considered unavoidable? And also, did the threat already, or are we responding to an attack? And a clear example of that is Pearl Harbor, 9/11. And also looking at other critical features, like looking at at a situation where responding to a massive casualty situation or crisis, or looking at something like a genocide, responding to that specific issue, like Rwanda, where the community over time, the international community over time, wanted intervention. And why is that? It's not just necessarily the international community in terms of government to government, but winning the hearts and minds of the people to support, to show that this is a clear threat to global security. In terms of legitimacy, there's two factors we should definitely take into account. One is when it comes to garnering consensus from the international community. Like, for instance, when Bush looked for the justification of use of force or the invasion of Iraq, immediately, per guidance from General Colin Powell, you should seek for support from the United Nations. And then also, too, with Obama, with regards to the no-fly zone in Libya, he quickly seeked for support from the United Nations Security Council, as well as the Arab League, as well as the GCC states, pretty much. So, and what you'll see from the executive branch is that the President of the United States was justified they'll use that as a justification, delivering it to the American people, that I have the international community supporting my decision of use of force. Another feature that we should take into account is the affordability. I think that's more of a factor now than before. And why is that? Well, in the United States, we are about roughly $31 trillion in debt. So not just some of our elected officials, but the American people are paying attention to the use of force in terms of the cost of it. And is it worth it? Just one airstrike alone costs millions of dollars, right? So what you're seeing now from a growing number of American people saying, is it worth it to conduct airstrikes versus pay for my infrastructure projects at home? So there's a lot of comparative analysis when it comes to conducting military operations, use of force, in comparison to what we could be doing at home. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you. Scott, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everybody. Again, I'd like to thank the Carnegie Council for the invitation to be here. This is great to be back. Long-standing relationship with this amazing institution. And like Asha, I need to provide the standard disclaimer. Anything that I say here is strictly my personal opinions as a scholar. It does not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, or the United States Military Academy, now that I've made the lawyers happy. So, just war. The legitimacy of just war, if you sort of look at the long-term tradition, there's one basic concept, and Asha had spoken to different aspects of this. And there's this term that you'll see over and over again. It's an ancient term, this notion of self-defense. If you want to make a claim in terms of what justifies the use of force, deadly force, right? Let's be very blunt in the kind of language that we use here. Killing other human beings, destroying property is an act that really requires this kind of very deep reflection and continued debate and even angst among those who are involved in this. Once you start talking about self-defense, you're on the most solid ground you could be on. The just war tradition begins with St. Augustine. Ancient Greeks talked about self-defense as well in terms of the basis for legitimizing the use of violence against others that may lead to violent death. But once you start unpacking this concept of self-defense, and it's something that we all understand intuitively, we see this codified not just ethically in the just war tradition, in international law. It's long-standing in terms of customary law. It is codified within the UN Charter. The UN Charter says, technically, according to the UN, the use of force, the use of military force is only legitimate after you've gone to the UN Security Council and you've received a majority vote. Then with that backing of international legitimacy that justifies the situation under which you use force, you can go and use military power as you see fit, as it's been authorized. However, it says in Article 51 of the UN Charter, nothing in this segment of the Charter denies the inherent right to self-defense for any actor if you find yourself under imminent threat, if you do not have time to actually go to a larger international body, the UN Security Council, being that classic institution that's obviously built in with the UN. So it's about self-defense. It's recognized in international law. It's recognized at the heart of just war theory. But once you start to unpack this is when it starts to get much more debatable and less clear, because we can define many situations, whether it's in a personal situation and codified by domestic law. Most countries' domestic law will exonerate somebody charged with murder if they can prove it was in legitimate self-defense. And of course, we bring that same principle to the international system. But that implies, first of all, that it's imminent, right? How close is this threat? Or is it just a fear of something that's gathering in the future? That begins to cloud the justification. When we move away from immediate human life to start talking about, defending other kinds of interests that human beings have, what about human enslavement, human liberty, right? Is it justified to use violent force to liberate those whose liberty has been taken away from them? How about property, right? We talk about the sovereign rights of any country to defend their sovereign territory against unprovoked aggression. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, what is proportional in terms of the use of force when it's not to protect the life of a human being or even a human being's liberty, but merely the possession of property? That becomes a little cloudier. And then what if we talk about a way of life? Cheap oil from the Middle East. To what degree can you justify maintaining open sea lanes and using military power to prevent, say, any one major regional state from controlling the free flow of oil, which would, of course, spike the prices and have immediate economic impacts on other people? Can you claim self-defense if it's about a way of life? What about freedom of navigation? Right? You have those who oppose your access to the so-called global commons. Do you have the right to take life of those who are trying to blockade you from moving ships through areas engaged in peaceful trade? So we always begin with this concept of self-defense, but where the conversation becomes really fun and complicated is when we start to unpack what is it that we're actually defending. How much does that umbrella actually cover?
Great. Yeah, I mean, the slide from national security to this international security idea is really a subjective one sometimes. Well, next we're going to turn to questions of in bello that take up the duties and rights of those who participate in war. But before I ask you about that, I want to situate this in terms of innovations in warfare. Whether it's the so-called revolution in military affairs, fourth generation warfare, whatever you want to call it, that has unfolded over the past 30 years. We could even look at more recent outbreaks, whether it's asymmetric warfare, hybrid warfare, or violent eruptions in the gray zone between war and peace, however you want to characterize it. To you, what key changes stand out for you as dramatically impacting how warfare is fought? technological, strategic, et cetera. What's new on the battlefield? Maybe we'll start with Scott and we'll come to Aisha. That way we'll take turns going first. Go ahead.
The obvious answer when we pose this question right now, of course, are autonomous systems, right? Autonomous weapons, autonomous reconnaissance assets, and artificial intelligence. My quick from the hip answer is nobody knows. There are a lot of smart people who are working this problem both in the government, outside the government, at think tanks, at universities. A tremendous amount of money, as we know, is being put into the development of autonomous systems and artificial intelligence with untold numbers of applications from warfare through peaceful interaction among human beings. You know better than I am a lot older than most people in this room, I would say, so you know better than I do where the cutting edge is in terms of these specific types of technologies. But clearly, anybody who's studying American defense policy and watching investment in technologies and innovation in different parts of the world, obviously, this is the first answer that you come up with. So then the challenge for anybody like us when asked, okay, what does the battlefield application of these types of weapons and capabilities mean for the conduct of war and issues of jus in bello, the ethical actual application of violence once you are in that space? All I can offer at this point, I've puzzled over this a lot, is there a way for us to think through both potential positive impacts and negative impacts as just a basic framework to ask ourselves, if we are watching these particular technologies being rolled out, being adopted by national governments, our own government, foreign governments, what kind of expectations should we hold our militaries to, right? Our militaries are accountable to, in the United States and many other countries around the world, accountable to civilian leadership, accountable to values and principles that our civilian leadership and our larger populations expect of them. So you can imagine a set of positive impacts that come from these kinds of capabilities. Again, autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence. If we think about reconnaissance alone, right, the ability to actually collect information through different assets, process information, and have a finer grained understanding of threat, right, coming back to what is it that you're actually confronting. You might imagine if this is what those doing this kind of intelligence analysis are focused on, if this is their priority, we might be in a much better position when the trigger is pulled, when the order is given, we would have a much higher confidence that, in fact, this is a legitimate target. We might have much more confidence that when we have precision-guided munitions based on targeting with increasingly sophisticated weapons, and this is not a new story, this is a 30, 40-year story of intelligence targeting and precision-guided munitions. But the better and better we get, then perhaps we reduce so-called collateral damage. The innocents who might, because of poor targeting, poor intelligence, get caught up in what otherwise is a legitimate use of force. So there's a good news story, I think, and I know that within the United States military, this is clearly a priority. But let's think about the potential flip side. If there's still so-called the fog of war and friction, even with increasing sophistication of how you understand developing threats, how you develop targets, how you make assessments of these deep ethical and strategic questions that anybody confronts before they give the order to pull the trigger. If this technology remains imperfect, if there are still uncertainties, yet our confidence now is much higher because, well, I have these fancy tools. This fancy tool is telling me I got it right, but maybe you don't have it right. So the more optimistic you are that you've got it right, the more confident you'll be, the more willing you'll be not to slow down and rethink, get others involved in this decision process before you make the order to pull the trigger. So the more confidence you have, the potential for mistakes are still out there, no matter how sophisticated the autonomous systems and the AI become. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yes, thank you. Amazing. Uh, just looking back at my military career as a cadet, and as far as reflecting on the evolution of warfare, we were trained on Vietnam jungle warfare type of style, and then lessons learned came out of the out of Iraq and Afghanistan, going in 3 years later after I was commissioned, where double down on counterinsurgency, counterattacks, and urban operations. So we were quickly moved on to, okay, we have to really get them trained up on these specific warfare style. And then doubling down on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, what became more of one of the main efforts in terms of hybrid warfare is information operations. Information operations was a big deal in terms of countering disinformation, misinformation, building up the critical capabilities, whether it's on offense or defense, as far as how can we effectively operate in an operational environment. And then, so going back to his point is that in terms of what you're seeing more about involving innovation is the technological changes that are happening. Of course, DoD is constantly looking at the fact of investing more in autonomous capabilities versus looking at the legacy capabilities on how should we retain them, upgrade them, or modernize them is the big question. So there's a back and forth with a lot of that happening, and how does that play out? And looking at the future of warfare, especially in like new domains like space, where you're seeing this constant investment in offensive and defensive capabilities, and how do they operate in that in terms of the satellite imageries, and in comparison to Russia and China, as far as how does it look, in the event of a war involved in a domain like space. So we're heading in that direction, I must say. And in terms of precision or becoming more adaptive or confident in working with autonomous capabilities, I think that is a big question. And that also is a situation where it impacts the rules of engagement, where how do we have confidence in ensuring that whatever we're doing in terms of reconnaissance or collection, are we really confident in this autonomous system? And then I think it's just a work in progress as far as correcting the approach. So I think what you're seeing is this a rapid adaptation to how do we effectively work on these autonomous systems in an operational environment.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that there seems to be like a shrinking of trying to expose your troops to less risk while there are new vulnerabilities discovered in cyberspace and outer space, et cetera. But Scott, I see you wanted to just chime in real quick.
You were led to the same thing that Asha's
okay.
comment led me to think back on. It's this question of cost. Right, the cost to those who are actually out there engaged in the use of military force, the decision to send soldiers, airmen, sailors into harm's way is part of the more rational strategic calculus that any leader has to make. And our ability to target long range, our ability to have increasing battlefield awareness has allowed us to develop standoff weapons. And frankly, the lower the cost becomes in terms of the risk to your own folks when you send them into harm's way, your willingness to actually pull the trigger goes up. Now that becomes a strategic calculation, not an ethical calculation. But in a weird way, if you think back on multiple points in history in terms of the emergence of ethical claims, oftentimes they didn't come out of some abstract, just war tradition comes out of a certain Christian theology, which is an abstract claim about human rights and our responsibility to treat other human beings in a certain way. but so much of the progress that has happened in human history in terms of introducing constraints on violence, it's been this interaction between the immense level of violence and casualties suffered by multiple combatants in a given conflict. And at one point, it becomes just, we can't do this anymore. The 30 Years' War, the famous, 1618 to 1648. Out of the 30 Years' War, it has religious origins in terms of a follow-on on the Protestant Reformation and Catholic states and Protestant states. Highest percentage of casualties as a percentage of the population at that time in world history, right? The 30 Years' War actually leads as the most deadly conflict as a percentage of the population, overall population at the time. And it rages for 30 years. It is unbelievably violent. And out of this comes the principle of sovereignty, in which through their own suffering, you have both rules, law, to mutually constrain the use of violence, but then it makes possible then ethical claims that are reinforcing, right? Legal claims about the right to be free from this kind of violence, interference in your own sovereign affairs. And they can, over time, work hand in hand. So I think there are multiple times through history in which we see that suffering by all parties who come to a place and they say, this cannot go on. We need new laws, we need new principles. And are we in a world now in which the lower the cost becomes, we don't have these tragic, horrifyingly tragic, but so much human progress has come through the suffering and lessons learned, right? Reflection on why did this happen to us? And the more you have major actors who can use military power, and it sounds ironic and paradoxical to say, but you got to say it out loud, the less we'll learn, right? The less we'll realize the value of both legal and ethical constraints on violence. At least certain parties will, given that lower cost.
Yes. I agree with the lower cost argument. In fact, what you've seen across both Democrat and Republican administrations is that there's a lot of investments when it came to special operations because of the number of uniformed personnel that participated was extremely low. And in an event of a casualty happening, the numbers were extremely low, and not that many people, the American people, did not know about it. So, which reminds me of why we're investing so much in AI and robotics, is because we want to avoid the massive level of casualties in a war. I don't think that the leadership right now for the past several years, especially in the United States, has the appetite to see the number of those, the massive amount of casualties in an operational environment or in warfare. And also, too, when you look at our near-peer competitors, especially our enduring competitor, who has not been in a war probably since 1940, right? I think, too, they don't necessarily want to engage in a physical, in-person, war-style crisis or an operational environment with us. I think they would rather do it more online, just like what you've seen a lot play out with the Russians, but a little bit different in terms of Ukraine. But definitely, when it comes to engaging the United States, it's more about online warfare than electronic warfare than in person.
I think we could talk a lot about the sort of paradoxes of the international sacrificial order and how traumatic learning drives the humanitarian system. But the tyranny of time demands, I think, that we move on to the just peace question. We've talked about just war, but the conduct of war usually influences the conditions of peace. How belligerents behave in armed conflicts matter because the manner of military defeat and its political consequences determine the reaction of local populations. The end of war may not necessarily be the end of conflict. It may, in fact, provoke further hostilities, especially if mass human rights violations are committed. At the start of the first millennium, in describing Rome's campaign against Germanic tribes, Tacitus wrote, "They make a wasteland and call it peace." With the scourge of war as virulent as ever, please unpack for us this notion of a just peace. What are its features? How is it achieved? Do you want to start this time, Asha?
Yes,
Please.
no worries. Well, looking at this question, I think about immediately peacekeeping, peace building, the implementation, the justified way of enforcing peace, especially what you see at the United Nations, is deploying a peacekeeping operation in a post environment. And the purposes of why they're doing it, well, it's to pretty much achieve sustainable peace, right? And well, how do we do that? Well, there are a couple of objectives, and one is to achieve political, economic, and legal reform. And why do we need to do that? Well, looking at the as a result of conflict, institutions have pretty much been weakened or collapsed. So if you look at the legal system, the loss of jobs, the loss of government, it needs to be restored. And so just going back to the justification in terms of peace, as far as the legal side of it, I must say that, when it comes to the conflict, who were the victims? Who needs justice? How do we achieve that? And in terms of the local courts, are they capable of justifying, being able to address that? Sometimes you have external affairs, legal systems or organizations like the War Tribunal of Yugoslavia or Rwanda that has to step in to help facilitate the legality piece to it as well. So that's very important. And then also looking at in terms of the economic reform, how do we take ex-combatants and reintegrate them into society? United Nations pretty much underscores the process of DDRs, demilitarization, demobilization, reintegration, bring them back into society, give them a job. That's a common recommendation. How do we reduce violence in a specific area? Give somebody a job. Right. And then in terms of the political approach, rebuilding the government, but in doing so, making sure that it's more inclusive. It includes different groups. In Afghanistan, you saw actively where they're ensuring that more women were represented in government. So I think that's important in terms of looking at the main pillars of it, but it's all about institutional building as far as being able to achieve sustainable peace.
Mm-hmm. That idea of sustainability, I think, is a really wonderful contribution. So thank you. Scott?
Yeah, that's really good. Sustainability. And adding the word just onto peace, when you pose that question, you have to pause and say, well, what's the difference? What's the distinction between peace or the sources of, right? I think that's at the heart of this question. The sources of peace, which is great, and the sources of just peace. And as I thought through this question, I realized that those are two potentially different things, the sources of just peace and the sources of a just peace. You can have peace imposed by power. You can have a highly stable, peaceful society at the domestic level and at the international level if it is enforced with enough brute power and intimidation, coercion, to keep people in line. So whether you're talking, again, Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan, right, his classic take on creating this all-powerful being that will relieve us of fearing each other, therefore we can go about our business every day. Power is at the center of peace, and peace then makes possible prosperity and health and commodious living and the other things he talks about. And you could think about theories of hegemony at the international level in which a great power uses its power to hurt, its power to reward, to keep others in line. And that's something different. That's not what we're talking about. So when you talk about different, whether it's within broken societies and reintegrating those who had been combatants, or a just peace, think, post-World War I, classic case of serious dissatisfaction with the status quo created at Versailles in 1919, and ongoing discussion of to what degree did this plant the seeds that led to World War II. So I come back to this notion of legitimacy. Sustainability depends on legitimacy. And so just peace is legitimate in that whether it's at a local level, whether it's at the international level, the key parties whose interests are directly impacted have to believe that whatever order you create, the rules, the distribution of power, the distribution of benefits in the society, fundamentally are the best we can get. This is okay with me. I would rather just live with this environment if I can trust the others that I may have been at war with prior to this to see it the same way that I do. Then it's about legitimacy. Then the question becomes, well, how do you generate that kind of legitimacy? And that's that kind of work that happens within failed states and societies that have suffered that kind of violence. We think about the post-World War II period. I mean, this is the most important within the Western world example of out of this horrifying catastrophe and the immense suffering across the combatants on a global level in World War II, the United States, having not suffered directly from this war, steps forward and says, we're not going to get sucked into a third one. We're going to fix this problem. And there was a receptiveness to this. The idea is, okay, America, what do you got in terms of recreating an international order that is going to prevent us from falling into what we have just gone through for a second time in 2 generations? And there's something in it for me and my people, right? So the post-World War II period, generating that legitimacy, however, without that suffering along the way, they're not receptive to this openness. So how do you bring local communities and international actors to a position where they say, yes, this is better than anything that might come if it breaks down? That's the challenge. How do you get buy-in from the key actors?
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you sort of also raised for us the whole question of sort of victor's justice, right? When the victor rewrites the rules, it creates this condition. We often talk about asymmetric warfare, but this is asymmetric peace, where it's imposed with uneven outcomes in this way. Well, keeping in mind the elements you have shared with us, I'm going to ask you to not only apply this to contemporary armed conflicts, but consider for us how upcoming challenges may be tackled. Now, put this in a certain context. There's always a paradox in these things. Albert Einstein made the sweeping claim that you cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. Nevertheless, the onset of World War II and other wars have demonstrated the importance of deterring and confronting aggression early. Reconciling these sensibilities forces us to think about what responsible preparation for war and responsible preparation for peace looks like. So what I want to ask you about is, what is on the horizon for just war and just peace? What is on your just peace agenda to address changes in war? If you could come up with some ideas about, if we were to redesign, some people say, what's taking place right now in the world is really a form of a World War III, and eventually there will be another tragic moment where we will recreate either the UN or some other type of fixtures. We see a few ideas out there, but I was just wondering if you see any things that we're not talking about enough, about just war, just peace at the international level. Anyone want to start, Scott, this time?
Yeah, sure. What is on the horizon for just peace? This has been an unbelievably tumultuous 2, 3, 4 years, right? And we don't need to rehearse the places in the world that have suffered immensely and have generated immense anger and discontent by observers around the world watching what has happened, and just the few major fires that are burning are just so ripe with unpredictable consequences in terms of how we are defining self-defense and who was the aggressor in this situation, who is on the side of justice in this situation. Within our own communities, we're torn apart by these questions. So it's a big question mark. One thing that I will say, and I'm going to harken back to some comments I made earlier. Joe Rosenthal and I were talking earlier about being sort of the elder statesman oftentimes, if I can use that august phrase in the room, Joel. In many places that we hang out, Jim. Unnecessarily bring you into this conversation. But I firmly believe, when I look back on the most progressive era in human history, it's after 1945, and that is not an accident. It goes back to the immense suffering of the first half of the 20th century. The world we were all born into was a product of the first half of the 20th century. And those who are in their older decades, we might not have lived experience of that, but we had parents and grandparents, and we studied in school, and it was part of our lived historic experience to appreciate that this is not the natural order of things. This was a painfully constructed international order that made the best of a horrifying catastrophe. And I think, frankly, for those who were involved in this project, in that moment of history, and I think this is one thing that Americans can be very proud of in terms of, with partners, finding a way forward from 1945 and producing a level of peace and prosperity that literally is unprecedented in human history. We are losing that memory, right? So to the degree that political order, a sense of legitimacy, a sense of what justice means, and constraints on our potential for violence against each other, what happens as generations continue to click on that, my students weren't born when 9/11 happened, for example, certainly have no personal experience of great power conflict as Cold War kids have. So I think it's really important. What's on the horizon for Just War is we need to be creating conversations and educational opportunities to remind each new generation of the first half of the 20th century, because it was fundamental in shaping so much goodness that we are at the risk of losing. And you made this point earlier about China, and that's spot on. The Chinese have never had this, suffered greatly. give the Chinese their due for a long period of their history. Yes. They talk about the century of humiliation with just cause. But it's been a long time since they've had this kind of experience directly themselves. So are we losing that immediacy of what could happen if this carefully constructed order, it haphazardly at times, fits and starts, back and forth, fades, breaks down. We don't appreciate, why does it work this way? So I see that as an ethical responsibility that older generations have to continue that part of the education and the conversation about the first half of the 20th century.
Keep it going.
Yes.
Before you chime in, I just want to remind people that we'll be in a few minutes taking questions, and if you have questions, please write them on the cards and pass them forward, please.
Yes. I agree with the old generation does need to communicate more with the younger generation as far as the shaping of Just War and Just Peace. I just have two quick points as far as this question. One is, I think one way we can look at it as far as shaping the future in terms of just peace and just war is looking at the reform of international institutions, and more specifically reforming the UN Security Council, expanding the UN Security Council. As a former Biden appointee, I'm proud to say that we advocated for that. The last U.S. ambassador to UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, believed in expanded to more seats that are represented from the global South, and those that are more prone to war issues involving conflict and war. So, and that will help develop policies in terms of prevention war, or how can we move forward them effectively with some sort of authority or power as well. So I think that's important to know, to relook at the reform of the Security Council. Another point too, in terms of American power, because it's still extremely relevant when it comes to shaping the hearts and minds globally, in America, what you're seeing in terms of the use of force or war, period, is that you're seeing this growing horseshoe issue between the right, the extreme right, the extreme left, and the middle, where because we went through 20 years of war, and there's not really that much of an appetite to go into another one. So you're seeing where this is actually marrying more of the American people that we're just not interested, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of activities going on with where the American people are just working together in terms of we don't want to go to war. And I think we're seeing that resonate globally where, just the administration right now especially does not have the public opinion to support that. So I find that quite fascinating that it amongst the three groups, they come together quickly to say, we're not in favor of it. Mm-hmm.
There's some consensus there on that one point.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we only have about 15 minutes, but maybe we'll take some questions that have come in. And I'll remind everybody that, there is speaking truth to power, but there's also stepping into traps that can be misconstrued and whataboutism and things of that. So I want to make sure that we don't fall into any of that. So since we don't have lived experience of the first half of the 20th century on a younger generation, how should we become more aware of this?
Read.
Yeah.
Read long form. Read books. It's the only way that we can touch the past. And I will tell you, I know one of the questions you had queued up for us, Peter, was what's on our nightstand.
Exactly. We didn't have time for it, but
please. If I can preview real quick, because it's directly relevant to this. I spend most of my time reading about the ancient Greeks, 5th century BC. I'm writing a book now on the origins of the ancient Athenian Empire, Persian invasion, and the coming of the Peloponnesian War. And I do it for two reasons. One, it's timeless, and it's not of this moment. So it gives me great relief so I don't doom scroll, we tend to do. But I'm reading the works of Herodotus and Thucydides and Plutarch and the Greek tragedians, and it is truly timeless. I mean, timeless, 2,500 years. Human beings are still the same. Radical changes in the character of our societies and our technology and geographic scale, et cetera, et cetera. But, there's just so much wisdom in history, and you only have access to it through reading, finding others who can geek out with you, find mentors, courses, documentaries, whatever grabs your interest. Read.
Yes, I agree. And if you don't want to read, please, which a lot of them are not doing, unfortunately, please navigate the media outlets engaging with the truth about history and even current events, but just please navigate the news media using the truth. Diversify it as far as looking at national media, international news like BBC News, all the way to documentaries, as mentioned. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe following up on those things, and I will have admit to Scott, I also have a penchant for reading the ancient Greeks. There's a wonderful version of Oedipus out. It's a modern adaptation I recommend people go see, but it got me, I saw it recently, and then I was like, I'm going to read Antigone again. And there's a lot of just war stuff in that.
There is.
It really, it's great.
There is.
But, since I think you brought it up, Asia, where should people get their information from? If you want to understand just war today, what sorts of things should we be reading?
War on the Rocks.
War on the Rocks,
It's
okay.
really good, foreignpolicy.com, right? I also, the military makes me do this, but Clausewitz.
Clausewitz,
right?
okay.
On war, Sun Tzu, The Art of the War. So.
The classics.
Yeah, the classics, absolutely.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Even if there are any new classics, let us know. Go ahead, Scott.
I like to read foreign news sources, right? In the United States, we do a lot of navel gazing, And we tend to go right around and around in productive circles, right? You watch, whether it's your feed with rapid fire news, or you try to get a little long form journalism now and then, which is really important because we have so many great outlets that are working and writers and journalists that are working in the United States. But foreigners, whether they're Brits, whether they're Germans, whether they're Japanese, Indians, don't obsess about the same things. They're still watching the world. They're still reporting on really important stories, but they don't become obsessive the way many American writers do. So I always, over a course of a week, I try to take in a healthy dose of high quality foreign reporting and writing. Yeah. English language, obviously. My language skills aren't that good.
That's a good point of triangulation, though, just
It
to
is.
hear
Yes, that's right.
those
And
other
scope
views.
of coverage, too. Scope of stories that they're paying attention to.
Great. All right, well, we have several other questions here. I want to make sure that we try and get our bang for the buck in asking something that seems to cut across a number of these questions. And a number of them seem to be about how leaders can build consensus around pathways to just peace. What more can leaders be doing in order to push us in these directions? I know this is sort of a policy question in some ways, but there's a real ethical one as well, because it imputes that we have a sense of what justice looks like, obviously. So if you want to speak to things that you think could help better shape how countries or the UN Security Council or whatever agent you want to look at as a legitimate authority, what more could they be doing to help propel this agenda? Any thoughts? Who would like to jump in on that one?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a great question. I think there are two ways in which we can facilitate conversations about and lead on and get people to think about issues of justice and ethics. And one may be effective sometimes, another may be effective more often. And this is just my personal take. I haven't studied this closely, so if you all disagree, please let me know. But we have universal abstract claims about human rights and about justice from a cosmopolitan, human-centered, global level. Right, that's a core part of the evolution of ethical reasoning and efforts to shape behavior based on ethical principles. That oftentimes is harder to get buy-in on by your own people when you're confronted with threats and challenges and fears and appetites that you want your leaders and your society to pursue. Some of the most effective conversations that I've seen in the last 30 years, really, and since 9/11, have been conversations, if you're thinking about America, let's just talk about Americans right now. Who are we? In my name, right, you've probably seen this, and this at certain points in our history has been a common refrain, not in my name. Right, my government is doing these things, not in my name. And what that can lead to is a conversation about, well, who are we? And whether or not others are doing these heinous things in this world, whether or not that global universal norm has broken down or is really not going to mobilize your own people by doing what is considered to be the ethical thing in treating others, maybe we can generate a conversation about, no, I don't care if other peoples don't respect this. This is who we are. This is who we are. And I would hope for all of us as individuals, we have that sense of individual character and the strong red lines that puts up in terms of our personal behavior in this world and our relationship with other people. That at key moments, since 9/11, we had all these challenges about torture and other kinds of things that were happening in reaction to that terrible event. Those were more effective in carrying changes in leadership behavior and American sentiment. When we turned it around to, who cares about the rest of the world? Let's just think about how can we hold our heads high and say, we stand for something. We are a noble, good people, and not in my name.
I look at it two ways. Well, first is we have to just learn more how to work with people that one side needs to know how to work with others on in terms of who they disagree with, right? And that's just the basics. Another point too is that what we're seeing actively from American leadership is that there's this global peacemaking operation going on, right? And just today there was in the Oval Office between Rwanda and Uganda, DRC. Yes, as far as a peace deal. There's some benefits to it, and then also there's some costs. But what's the benefits to it is that the reality is, in terms of looking in the world, there are still countries to this day that rely on the United States to prioritize these peace deals, and if it's done the right way, ethically, using good ethics, it could turn out to be a good thing, right? So, and if those peace deals are again fair, just, and achieving sustainable peace, then it's a good thing. So I do like, in terms of America prioritizing, giving a lot of visibility to peace deals like what you're seeing, one that's happening regarding Africa between Rwanda and the DRC, and then you had also Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so when that happens, it starts to energize the rest of the international community to take it a lot more serious than being a low visibility, the low vis approach in terms of looking at that issue. But it has to be done right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's a very fine line ethically here.
Right.
We only have a minute or two left, so maybe I'll just finish up a thought and get your reactions to it. Several of the things that you both have said remind me of, there's this school of thought and this sort of subfield of security studies known as military Orientalism. It's based on the ideas of Edward Said, and it basically says how we fight tells us something about the culture that we're fighting against, right? It's a way that if we fight in a certain way, our identity becomes something, and it can contribute to either peace or war. And I mention this because recently we see countries trying to pull out of the international landmine ban, and it's the countries of Eastern Europe, right? It's the countries, it's the Baltic states. Ukraine has now said they want to suspend it, and obviously they have security reasons for why they want to return to it. But as we know, use of landmines they usually impact civilians. And so, we're at a real crossroads, I think, in international politics about the humanitarian agenda. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on where you see it going. I mean, is this wars, either in what's taking place in Ukraine or any place else around the world, the system is bending. Are we going to break before we are able to bend the arc of justice backwards? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's a big question to end on.
That is a huge question.
I know, but I think that's the one we want to know. Is we've talked about ethics in war and ethics in peace, and do you have any thoughts on where this may be headed? I mean, you mentioned earlier the crisis that is needed to change things.
If I could. So I told Joel about 2 hours ago, if I have a chance to bring E.H. Carr into this conversation, by God, I'm going to do it. Now, this is right. This is an E.H. Carr moment. Okay. So some of you may be familiar with E.H. Carr. If you're not, E.H. Carr, again, early 20th century, he was a Brit, he was a diplomat, he was an intellectual. He wrote one of the most important mid-20th century books called The 20 Years Crisis. It was a diagnosis from his perspective of what went wrong with the expectations of peace coming out of World War I. And he is remembered as a hardcore realist, and those feckless liberals making all these gross mistakes. They let Hitler rise without opposition, and therefore World War II. That is a misreading of E.H. Carr. If you read his first chapter of that book, the last paragraph on page 10, I know it because I teach it all the time. I love it. It's so wise. He makes this argument that international relations emerges as a field of study out of the wreckage of World War I. And it looked at war as a disease, and we need to bring the scientific method to the study of the causes of war to diagnose and then treat and cure this cancer. And he said, however, because we were so purpose-driven, we went through this utopian phase at first. Pie in the sky ideas, no connection to reality. It was only when We had a rigorous study of the facts and just the way the world works, like science has to just study, it doesn't matter what you wish your chemistry lab to produce, the chemistry is going to work out the way the chemistry works out. We need to have that same realist approach to this. So people say, well, I guess that's just it. You throw up your hands, the world is the way it is. Sow the landmines, say, we're back to 1932 again or whatever. But he ends it by saying, utopianism is a necessary corrective to what he calls, quote unquote, the barrenness of realism. Realism is the attitude of old age. And you can never give up the sense of human progress coming from this deliberate interaction between studying the world the way it is and being wise enough to recognize that here are the things that we can't change. But man, always looking for opportunities to say, no, these things are manipulable. We can change these. We can shape these. We can shape behaviors and incentives. And let's never just throw up our hands and say, it's etched in stone, adapt or die. So E.H. Carr, and it's an enduring tension between the two. We'll never get away from it. Your generation will never get away from it. You just embrace it. What things do you have to just accept and live with? Where are those pockets to keep pushing for progress?
Yes.
Isha, the final word is yours.
I like the point with pushing for progress. I look at it as a correction or adjustment. Your example reminds me of when you had a growing number of African countries withdraw from the ICC, International Criminal Court. Yeah. Then they went back in, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And what it's telling you is that these smaller, some middle states are willing, or they're more active in proving a point to the international community that if a certain international institution or a cause or a treaty does not stand for us or doesn't align with what's going on now, we have no problem of withdrawing. So I think that's good for the international system right now, and you're also seeing that play out. It's not really focused on war and peace, but looking at reforming the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Trade Organization. There's a lot of discussions in Europe on, should we just pull out because it's not preventing the global tariffs, right? Should we just create our own? And with other countries, without the United States and China, but we're creating a rule-based system that does not include them. It'll create fragmentation. So there's, in the international community right now, there's this constant thinking of how do we correct the system or how do we adjust? And so I think that's pretty good.
Well, Aisha, Scott, I think you have bent the arc back towards justice. So thank you. Thank you.